The silver cake server clicked against the fine china, a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the low hum of a jazz saxophone drifting from the hidden speakers. Frances Aldridge stood at the head of the table, her silk sleeve brushing against a massive centerpiece of white hydrangeas. The scent of those flowers, heavy and cloying, mixed with the beeswax from the candles and the unmistakable powdery trail of Estee Lauder Beautiful that had followed Frances into every room for 14 years. 11 people sat around the long mahogany table, their faces blurred by the soft amber glow of the candlelight, but my focus remained on the white envelope sliding toward me. It moved slowly across the white tablecloth past the untouched crystal flutes of champagne until it came to rest inches from my hand. "I thought you deserved to hear it from family first," Frances said. Her voice was warm, measured, and perfectly pitched, the result of 26 years in a classroom. Directly. The air in the private dining room at Mimosa seemed to thicken, smelling of seared duck and expensive perfume. My hands stayed flat on the table, feeling the cold, polished wood beneath the cloth. To my left, Paula Mercer set her fork down with a deliberate clatter. "That is not how the procedure works," Frances Paula said. Her voice was flat, hard as the marble floors in the lobby downstairs. Frances did not look at her. She kept her gaze fixed on me, her eyes bright and steady behind her designer frames. "I am simply making sure Laurel is not blindsided by a stranger knocking at her door tomorrow morning," she said. "I thought it was kinder this way." Marcus sat to my right, staring at the bubbles rising in his glass. He had not looked at me since we sat down. He had not spoken since the appetizers arrived. His jaw was set, a tight knot of muscle pulsing at the corner of his mouth, a physical map of a decision he had made weeks ago. "Thank you, Frances," I said. I did not reach for the envelope. I did not have to. I knew what was inside. I knew the exact wording of the filing Marcus had signed in his office at Beaumont and Hale 3 days ago. I reached down to the black leather bag resting against my chair. The zipper made a dry metallic hiss in the sudden silence of the room. I pulled out a gray folder, thick and heavy, and placed it on the table. I slid it forward until it sat perfectly parallel to Frances's white envelope. Aldridge VCORB. The bold black text on the cover read, "Civil complaint filed." Frances lowered her champagne glass. She did it slowly, carefully, the way a person moves when they are trying very hard not to break something. The warmth in her expression did not vanish. It simply curdled. "I think there has been a misunderstanding about what this evening was supposed to be," Frances said. The door to the private room opened. A man in a charcoal suit stood in the frame, his eyes scanning the table until they found mine. Craig Corbin did not offer an apology for being late. He simply walked to the empty chair at the far end of the table and sat down. 14 months, I thought. I had spent 426 days preparing for the silver server to click against the china. I had spent every one of those days building a folder that would turn this room into a crime scene. 14 months earlier, the world had smelled like stale coffee and wet pavement. I was 47 years old, a woman who designed beautiful spaces for people who never intended to live in them, and I was sitting in my studio at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night. My name is Laurel Aldridge, and that was the night I realized my husband was parking his Lexus in places he told me he never went. The LED clock on my desk glowed a cold digital blue. 9:24. Marcus had sent a text 3 hours ago, saying he was working late on the Uptown Hotel project. It was the same text he had sent every Tuesday for 3 months. I sat in the silence of Voss Design, surrounded by fabric swatches and half-finished floor plans, and watched the headlights of cars moving along Tryon Street. I did not go home. I drove toward the South End instead, the heater in my car humming a low, steady drone. I turned onto a side street 2 blocks from a new luxury apartment complex. The Lexus was there. It was parked under a street lamp, the silver paint shimmering under the yellow light. I did not stop. I did not call him. I drove past counting to 20, then circled the block and went home to an empty house. I sat in my dark office at home and opened my laptop. The keys felt cold under my fingertips. I created a new folder, hidden 3 layers deep in a backup drive. I named it MISC, Laurel. Inside the first file, I typed the date, the time, and the address. I told myself I was being methodical. I told myself that facts were the only thing that could survive the cloying scent of Frances Aldridge's hydrangeas. A month later, I sat at the dinner table in Frances's house in Myers Park. The room smelled of roasted chicken and wood smoke from the fireplace. 12 people were there, including Ted Hartley, a senior partner at Marcus's firm, and a woman named Renata Corbin. Renata was a board member for the foundation. Frances ran a woman with a quick, practiced laugh and a way of touching her gold leaf earrings when she spoke. Renata is doing such wonderful work for the foundation, Francis said, leaning toward Marcus. I think the two of you would find quite a bit of common ground on the Uptown project. Marcus nodded, his expression polite and distant. I watched the way Francis looked from Marcus to Renata and back again. It was a look of approval, a silent blessing given over crystal water goblets and expensive silver. Craig Corbin sat at the end of the table, his eyes fixed on his plate, a man who had learned how to be invisible in his own life. I took a sip of water. The ice clinked against my teeth. I memorized the way the gold earrings caught the light. I memorized the silence of Craig Corbin. 11 months ago, on a Monday morning that smelled like rain and ozone, the jazz in my studio was interrupted by a notification on my phone. A photo had been posted to a church group chat I had forgotten to mute. It was a group shot taken at Lake Norman. 4 people stood on a wooden dock laughing. Marcus stood in the center, his arm brushed against Renata Corbin's shoulder. Marcus had told me he was at a firm retreat in Pinehurst that weekend. Pinehurst was 90 miles from Lake Norman. I zoomed in on the screen. Renata was wearing navy linen, her hair windblown. On her ears were the gold leaf earrings Marcus had given me for my birthday the previous October. The ones he told me were lost when I couldn't find them in January. He had spent 3 days helping me search the house for them, his voice full of concern and frustration. I set the phone on the desk. My breath felt tight in my chest, a hard physical pressure that made it difficult to swallow. I walked to the small kitchenette in the back of the studio and poured a glass of water. I drank it, all the coldness hitting the back of my throat. I went back to the desk and opened the gray folder on my laptop. Version 9. I uploaded the photo and timestamped it. I matched it against the purchase record I had kept for the jewelry. Then I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had saved 6 months ago. Sandra Tate Law, how can I help you? The receptionist asked. My name is Laurel Aldridge, I said. I looked out the window at the Charlotte skyline, the buildings sharp and clear against the gray sky. I need to schedule a consultation. The parking garage beneath my office was a cavern of concrete and cold air smelling of oil and old exhaust. I sat in my car for 20 minutes after the call, watching the fluorescent lights flicker overhead. I thought about my mother. I thought about the way she used to clean the kitchen for 3 hours before my father came home, her face a mask of calm that I used to think was strength. I realized then that it was not strength. It was a cage. I am not going to live in that kitchen, I whispered to the empty car. 10 days later, I sat in Sandra Tate's office overlooking Tryon Street. Sandra was 52 years old and sat with the posture of a woman who never felt the need to apologize for her presence. She listened to me for 20 minutes without interrupting her pen, moving steadily across a yellow legal pad. North Carolina is a fault state for divorce, Sandra said, setting the pen down. Adultery is grounds. But you mentioned she is a local businesswoman with significant property. Are you interested in pursuing an alienation of affection claim? Explain that, I said. Sandra leaned forward. The law allows you to sue the third party for the destruction of the marital bond. It is a powerful tool, Laurel, but it requires documentation. It requires proof of willful conduct. Build the case, I said. Do not confront him. Do not change anything at home. We work in the shadows until the shadows are long enough to cover them both. Sandra nodded. We will need a forensic accountant, and you need to protect your business. Voss Design was yours before the wedding. James Whitaker, the attorney Marcus will likely hire, will try to argue it is a marital asset. We start building the wall around your studio today. I left her office and drove to a small electronics store on the edge of town. I bought a voice recorder no larger than a credit card. I put it in my work bag tucked into a side pocket where it would stay for the next 9 months. The Easter picnic at the church was held on a day that smelled of freshly cut grass and lily pollen. I wore a pale blue dress that Francis had told me was flattering. I smiled at the deacons. I laughed at Marcus's jokes. I was a ghost in my own life, a silent observer recording the architecture of my own betrayal. Darren Pruitt, the forensic accountant, called me 2 weeks later. His voice was dry, clinical, the sound of a man who dealt in numbers because people were too unreliable. I have tracked $47,000 in dissipation, Darren said. Hotels at Lake Norman, Asheville, and downtown Charlotte. There is also a secondary phone plan paid through a personal account that is fed by monthly transfers from your joint savings. Keep going, I said. There is more, Laurel. I am seeing $30,000 moved into an investment account with an LLC. I need more time to find out who else is on that paperwork. Take all the time you need, I said. Francis called me on a Tuesday afternoon in July. The sun was baking the pavement outside my studio, and the air conditioner was humming a strained, rhythmic song. I want to host your birthday dinner this year, Francis said. There is a new place called Mimosa. They have a lovely private room. I think it would be so much nicer than something at the house. That is very thoughtful of you, Frances, I said. I will handle the invitations, she continued. I just want it to be special. And the cake should be from Della's. Don't you think I remember how much you love their almond cake? I had not eaten a cake from Della's in 5 years. Marcus knew that. Frances was not guessing. She was asserting. That works perfectly, I told her. I hung up the phone and sent an email to Sandra Tate. My mother-in-law is building an audience, I wrote. She is choosing the guests and the venue. She is preparing a stage. Good, Sandra replied. Do not discourage her. Let her build the biggest stage she can manage. 5 months ago, the alliance formed. Sandra called me into her office for a conference call. The voice on the other end was measured, hesitant, the sound of a man who had spent too much time measuring things that didn't add up. My name is Craig Corbin, the man said. I am in the process of a divorce from Renata. During our discovery, my attorney subpoenaed her cloud backups. I found 3 years of messages with your husband. I stood by the window of Sandra's office, watching the traffic below. The silence in the room was absolute. There is a text from Frances Aldridge to my wife, Craig said. It was sent in September 2 years ago. Do you want me to read it? Yes, I said. He needs someone who understands what he has to be, Craig read. His voice did not waver. Be patient. The words felt like a physical blow, a sharp pain behind my ribs that made it hard to draw a full breath. Frances had not been a bystander. She had not been a mother hoping for the best. She had been the architect. She had been feeding Renata Corbin contracts through the foundation, building a bridge for her son to walk across while she was still sitting at my dinner table. She was investing in a replacement, Sandra said after the call ended. The affair was the personal side. The business referrals were the professional side. They were building a new life for Marcus before they even told you the old one was over. 9 days ago, I stood at the clerk's counter at the Mecklenburg County Superior Court. The room smelled of old paper and industrial cleaner. The clerk pressed a heavy ink stamp onto the gray folder. The sound was loud, final, like a gavel hitting a block. Aldridge v. Corbin. I walked out into the October sunshine. The air was crisp, smelling of dried leaves and wood smoke. I got into my car and sat for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I did not feel a sense of triumph. I felt a profound, heavy sense of clarity. I drove back to the studio and walked past the samples of linen and silk, past the sketches of rooms that would never exist. Let's run through the lighting section for the hotel project, I told my lead designer. I have some notes on the lobby sconces. I worked until 6 o'clock. I went home and ate dinner with Marcus. I listened to him talk about his day. I watched him check his phone when he thought I wasn't looking. I was quiet. I was polite. I was the woman they thought I was. Now in the private room at Mimosa, the silence was so heavy it felt as if the walls were closing in. Frances looked at the gray folder on the table. She looked at the damages sought. $500,000. Craig Corbin sat at the end of the table, his presence a silent testimony that the secrets were no longer ours. Marcus finally looked up from his champagne. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a sudden sharp realization. Ted Hartley cleared his throat and set his napkin on the table. He did not look at Marcus. He looked at the gray folder. I think I should be going, Ted said. Paula Mercer picked up her champagne glass and looked at Frances over the rim. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The jazz continued to play a soft mocking sound in the center of the room. The hydrangeas stood white and still, their cloying scent filling the air. The birthday dinner Frances had spent 8 months planning was over. The quiet in the private dining room at Mimosa was no longer the heavy, curated silence of Frances Aldridge's social authority. It was the frantic, jagged stillness of a trap snapping shut. Across the table, Marcus finally looked at me, his face draining of color until he matched the bone-white hydrangeas towering between us. His hand, usually so steady when he was presenting a closing argument at the firm, trembled just enough to make the ice in his glass chime a soft, mocking tune. He looked at the gray folder, then at the white envelope his mother had just pushed toward me, and I saw the moment he realized that his ambush had been met with a siege. 14 months of being the quiet wife, the one who smiled at charity galas and rearranged the guest towels, had led to this exact second of clarity. I felt the cool weight of the air conditioning on my skin and the faint, bitter scent of the almond cake that no one was going to eat. My mind drifted back to the morning the foundation of my life began to crack, long before I knew how to navigate a courtroom or subpoena a heart. It was a Monday morning in early November 11 months ago, and the studio was filled with the smell of rain and fresh sawdust from a shipment of custom cabinetry. I was sitting at my desk, my fingers tracing the grain of a white oak sample, trying to ignore the dull, persistent ache of a marriage that had felt like an empty room for years. The office was quiet, save for the steady, rhythmic patter of rain against the large glass windows overlooking Dilworth. My phone vibrated on the desk, a sharp, insistent buzz that broke my concentration. It was a notification from the church ladies' group chat, a digital hive of bake sales and prayer chains that I usually kept on a permanent mute. I went to clear the alert, but my thumb hovered over the screen. Someone had posted a gallery of photos from a weekend trip to Lake Norman. I tapped the screen, the blue light of the 5.2-inch display reflecting in my eyes. The first few images were typical sunset over the water, a spread of appetizers on a wooden deck, a group of women in sun hats. Then I saw it. The photo was crisp, the autumn sun catching the ripples on the lake behind a group of 4 people standing on a dock. In the center was Marcus, his head tilted back in a laugh I hadn't heard in months. His arm was draped casually, comfortably across the shoulders of Renata Corbin. She was radiant in navy linen, her hair wind-blown and free. I felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the draft in the studio. Marcus had told me that weekend was a mandatory firm retreat in Pinehurst, nearly 90 miles away from Lake Norman. He had kissed me goodbye on Friday morning, complaining about the long hours of golf and networking he was going to have to endure. I zoomed in on Renata's face. She was smiling at the camera, but my eyes locked onto her ears. Dangling from her lobes were the gold leaf earrings Marcus had given me for my 46th birthday the previous October. They were custom pieces, delicate and distinctive, and I had spent 3 days in January weeping as Marcus helped me tear apart the house looking for them. He had held me as I cried, whispering that they were just things that we would find them, or he would buy me something even better. I set the phone face down on the oak sample. My breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, and the room seemed to tilt on its axis. I walked to the small kitchenette in the back of the studio, my legs feeling like lead. I poured a glass of filtered water, watching the bubbles rise to the surface, and drank it all in 3 long, desperate gulps. The coldness hit the back of my throat, grounding me, pulling me back from the edge of a scream I knew I couldn't afford to let out. I went back to the desk and opened my laptop, my movements slow and deliberate. I opened the hidden folder on my drive, the one I had started months ago when the late nights at the office first became a pattern. I uploaded the screenshot of the Lake Norman photo marking the date, the location, and the timestamp. I matched it against the digital receipt for the earrings I had saved in my personal cloud. For 11 months I had been reasonable. I had told myself I was being paranoid, that the car parked outside the building on Tryon Street was a coincidence, that the hushed phone calls in the middle of the night were just work stress. But the earrings weren't a coincidence. They were a signature. I didn't call Marcus. I didn't call Paula. Instead, I scrolled through my contacts until I found a number I had saved 6 months earlier, after hearing a rumor at a design conference. I pressed the button, the dial tone ringing loud and hollow in the empty studio. Sandra Tate Law. How can I help you? The voice on the other end was professional and bright. My name is Laurel Aldridge, I said, my own voice sounding foreign to my ears, hard and thin like a wire. I need to schedule a consultation. After I hung up, the silence of the studio felt different. It wasn't the silence of work. It was the silence of a house being cleared out before a storm. I grabbed my keys and headed down to the parking garage, the air heavy with the smell of wet concrete and car exhaust. I sat in my car in the darkest corner of level B2, the overhead fluorescent lights flickering with a sickly yellow hum. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I didn't see a victim. I saw the ghost of my mother standing in her pristine kitchen, with her bruised heart hidden behind a silk blouse, waiting for a man who never looked her in the eye. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me, followed by a cold, burning heat. I was not going to be the woman who waited. I opened my laptop on my lap, the screen illuminating the dark interior of the car. I looked at the timeline I had been building in the gray folder. 11 months of data points. I had enough to know what was happening, but I didn't have enough to end it on my terms. I closed the laptop and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I had been building a case for nearly a year without realizing it. Now I was going to build a fortress. 10 days later, I was sitting in Sandra Tate's office in Uptown. The room was decorated in neutral tones that felt clinical rather than comforting, and the large windows offered a panoramic view of the city that Marcus helped run. Sandra sat across from me, her dark hair pulled back in a sharp bob, her eyes scanning the documents I had printed out. North Carolina is a fault state for divorce, Sandra said, her voice a calm, low alto. Adultery is grounds, and it carries weight in the division of assets. But you mentioned Renata Corbin is a business owner. I nodded, watching the way Sandra's pen hovered over her legal pad. She is a partner in a commercial real estate firm. She has property in her own name. Sandra set the pen down and looked at me with a level of intensity that made me feel seen for the first time in a decade. Are you familiar with the term alienation of affection? I told her I wasn't. It is a civil tort, Sandra explained. It allows a spouse to sue a third party for the loss of the love and affection of their partner. It is difficult to prove and it is rare in most states, but North Carolina is the gold standard for it. If we can show that she willfully and maliciously intervened in your marriage, we can pursue her for substantial damages. Do you know her husband? Sandra asked. I thought of the man sitting at the end of Frances's table, the engineer who barely spoke, the man who looked like he was constantly calculating the load-bearing capacity of a room. I've met him, I said. Craig Corbin. Sandra's eyes narrowed slightly. We build the case right the first time, she said. Do not confront Marcus. Do not change your routine. You continue to be the wife he expects you to be while we build the documentation to prove he is the man you know he is. She told me I needed to protect my studio, that James Whitaker, the man Marcus would inevitably hire, would go after every cent Voss Design had made during the marriage. I need every contract from before you said I do, Sandra said. Every invoice that proves this business was built on your name alone. I left her office feeling heavier than when I entered, but the weight was different. It was the weight of armor. As I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the Charlotte sun felt blindingly bright. I looked up at the glass towers, realizing that for 14 years I had been designing beautiful interiors for people while my own home was a hollow shell. I started my car and felt the engine thrum beneath me, a steady, powerful heartbeat. I was committed. I didn't know then that the hardest part wasn't going to be the secrets or the lawyers. It was going to be the cake. It was going to be the almond cake, and the white hydrangeas, and the look on Frances Aldridge's face when she realized she wasn't the only one who knew how to plan a party. The click of the silver cake server against the china in the private dining room at Mimosa sounded like a gunshot in the vacuum of my memory, pulling me back from the shadow of the past into the cold, fluorescent reality of my betrayal. I looked at Marcus, whose fingers were now white where they gripped the edge of the tablecloth, and then at Frances, who remained as still as a portrait of a southern matriarch, her eyes darting toward the gray folder I had placed on the purported table. That folder was the culmination of 9 months of living as a ghost in my own home, a period where every I love you from Marcus felt like a grain of sand in a mounting pile of evidence. It was 9 months ago, during the damp heat of a Charlotte spring, that I officially crossed the threshold from a wife who suspected into a woman who prepared. I had hired Darren Pruitt, a man who looked like he had been carved out of old tax codes and IRS audits. He sat in Sandra Tate's office, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal pale, thin forearms, and spread a series of spreadsheets across the desk. The paper felt dry and sharp against my fingertips, a stark contrast to the velvet and silk swatches that usually filled my days at Voss Design. The numbers did not lie even when the man who shared my bed did. Darren pointed to a column of figures that represented $47,200 in unexplained withdrawals and credit card charges over the last 8 months. There were charges for boutique hotels in Asheville and hidden dinners in the South End places where the air smelled of wood smoke and deception. I watched his pen circle a $30,000 transfer to a joint investment account with a third party, an LLC that I had never heard of. We have enough for a dissipation claim, Sandra said, her voice a steady anchor in the room. But for the alienation of affection suit, we need more than just money trails. We need to show the heart of the matter. I nodded, feeling a cold, hard knot of determination settle in my stomach. I went back to the studio that evening, the smell of sawdust and expensive floor wax filling the air. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the small black voice recorder I had purchased 3 months earlier. It was no larger than a credit card, a sleek piece of technology that felt heavy with the weight of the secrets it was about to hold. I slipped it into the side pocket of my leather work bag, knowing that in North Carolina, I only needed my own consent to record a conversation. I spent the next several weeks performing the role of the dutiful Aldridge wife. I attended the church Easter picnic, wearing a pale blue linen dress that Frances had complimented with a touch of patronizing sweetness. The air smelled of grilled chicken and lily pollen, and I smiled at the deacons while my mind counted the seconds Marcus spent glancing at his phone. I had become a master of the polite empty smile, a woman who could discuss upholstery density while mentally filing away the time Marcus returned home from his late nights at the firm. Frances called me on a Tuesday afternoon in July, her voice sounding like warm honey over the line. I want to host your birthday dinner this year, she said, her tone making it clear that it was not a question. There is a new place called Mimosa, and they have a lovely private room. I think it would be so much nicer than something at the house. "That is very thoughtful of you, Francis," I replied, my voice as smooth as polished stone. "I will take care of the invitations and the guest list," she continued, her confidence radiating through the phone. "And the cake should be from Della's, shouldn't it? I remember you always liked their almond cake." I hadn't eaten an almond cake from Della's in 5 years, a fact Marcus knew well, but I realized then that Francis wasn't asking about my preferences. She was setting a stage. She was building a room full of witnesses, an audience for the moment she planned to deliver her own version of a birthday gift. I hung up and immediately sent an email to Sandra Tate. "My mother-in-law is building an audience," I wrote. "She is picking the venue, the guest list, and the cake." "Good," Sandra replied within minutes. "Do not discourage her. Let her build the room." A few days later, I sat in Sandra's office again, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. Darren Pruitt was there, looking more energized than I had ever seen him. "I traced the LLC," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "The third party involved in that $30,000 transfer is Renata Corbin." The name felt like a physical weight in the air. Renata, the woman Francis had introduced to Marcus at the foundation gala, the woman who laughed too loudly at his jokes and wore gold earrings that matched my own. "We have the direct connection now," Sandra said, her eyes locking onto mine. "We have the money, we have the third party, and we have the history. We just need to wait for the moment they think they've won." I drove home that night through the winding streets of Myers Park, the ancient oaks arching over the road like the ribs of a cathedral. I pulled into the driveway of the house Marcus and I had shared for 14 years, a house that now felt like a stage set, where I was the only one who had read the final act of the script. I walked into the kitchen, the smell of lemon furniture polish and expensive candles greeting me. Marcus was sitting at the island, a glass of bourbon in his hand, and his eyes fixed on a legal brief. He looked up and smiled, a practiced, handsome expression that no longer reached his eyes. "Rough day at the studio?" he asked, his voice full of the casual concern he had perfected over a decade. "Just a lot of moving parts," I told him, setting my bag on the counter and feeling the small, hard square of the voice recorder through the leather. "Just making sure everything is in its right place." I went upstairs to wash my face, staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My mother had stayed in her marriage because she was afraid of what the people in the pews would say. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of the pews. I was afraid of becoming a woman who lived her life in the silence between the clicks of a silver server and the lies of a man who thought I was too quiet to notice the floor being removed from beneath my feet. The silence in the bathroom of our Myers Park home was brittle, a thin sheet of glass held together by nothing but my own labored breathing. I stared at my reflection in the vanity mirror, the marble countertop beneath my hands feeling like a slab of ice. 14 years of sharing a sink, a bed, and a name, yet the woman looking back at me was a stranger who had spent the last 9 months learning the topography of a lie. I could hear Marcus downstairs, the muffled sound of the nightly news anchor, providing a low staccato rhythm to the house that used to feel like a sanctuary. Now every floorboard creaked with the weight of what I carried in my leather work bag. I reached out and touched the cool glass of the mirror, my fingers tracing the faint lines around my eyes. My mother had stayed in her house until the day she died, hiding the bruises of her heart behind a collection of vintage brooches and a perfectly manicured lawn. She had died in a house that was a museum of her own silence. I pulled my hand away, the smudge of my fingerprint, the only evidence that I was still there, still breathing, still fighting. I was 47 years old, and I was no longer a wife waiting for her husband to come home. I was a cartographer of betrayal, and I had finally mapped the center of the storm. The transition from the damp, heavy heat of July into the crisp, deceptive clarity of autumn brought a new kind of energy to the studio at Voss Design. The smell of sawdust was replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of cold air and the scent of expensive wool samples. It was 5 months ago, on a Thursday afternoon that smelled of ozone and rainy pavement, that the B story of my life finally merged with the main narrative. I was standing in Sandra Tate's office, the large windows offering a panoramic view of the Charlotte skyline that felt like a grid of secrets I was slowly deciphering. Sandra was sitting behind her desk, her dark hair pulled back in a sharp bob that mirrored the precision of her mind. "Someone reached out," Sandra said, her voice dropping into that low, professional alto she used when the stakes were about to change. "I need you to be here for this." She pressed a button on her desk phone, and the speaker crackled to life with a dial tone that seemed to ring through the very marrow of my bones. After 3 rings, a man's voice filled the room. It was measured, hesitant, the sound of someone who had spent too much time counting the cost of his own life. "My name is Craig Corbin," the voice said. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure in my chest, a physical tightening that made it difficult to draw a full breath. Craig Corbin, the man who had sat at the end of Francis Aldridge's dinner table like a ghost at his own feast. The engineer who looked like he was constantly calculating the load-bearing capacity of a room that was already collapsing. "I am not doing this to help you, Mrs. Aldridge," Craig continued, his voice sounding like dry parchment. "I am doing this because what I found is relevant to my own case, and I am required by my attorney to disclose it during our discovery." Sandra leaned forward, her eyes locked on the speaker. "We understand, Mr. Corbin. What are you willing to share with us?" Timeline, Craig said. 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days. They started in April 3 years ago. "I have the messages, Mrs. Aldridge. I have the cloud backups Renata thought she had deleted. I have the discussions about locations, the discussions about the LLC, and the discussions about the foundation." He paused, and the silence on the line was so heavy I could almost feel the weight of it in the room. "And I have your mother-in-law," Craig said. I reached out and gripped the edge of Sandra's desk, the wood grain biting into my palm. "Frances," I whispered. "There is a text message from Frances Aldridge to my wife," Craig said. "It was sent in September 2 years ago. Do you want me to read it to you?" "Yes," I said the word, sounding like a shard of glass in my throat. "He needs someone who understands what he has to be," Craig read. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made the words even more devastating. "Be patient." The air in Sandra's office seemed to vanish. I stared at the speaker, my mind reeling. Frances had not been a bystander. She had not been a mother hoping for the best, or a woman blinded by her own love for her son. She had been the architect. She had been the one whispering in Renata's ear, encouraging her, telling her to wait while she sat at my dinner table and told me how much she admired my work ethic. "But there is context, Mrs. Aldridge." Craig said, his voice regaining that clinical engineering edge. "Over the past 2 years, 3 major commercial real estate contracts through the Aldridge Foundation network were referred directly to Renata's firm. The total value of the commissions is approximately $2,400,000. Every single one of those referrals came through Frances." Sandra took a sharp, audible breath. "Frances was feeding her business," she said, her pen flying across her legal pad. "Frances was investing in her," Craig corrected. "The affair was the personal side, a way to keep Marcus tethered. The referrals were the professional side, a way to build a replacement for you that was already integrated into the Aldridge financial machine. Renata didn't just want your husband, Mrs. Aldridge. She wanted the life Frances was building for her. The affair was her leverage and her insurance at the same time. And when I file the alienation of affection suit, all of that comes out," I said, the realization hitting me with the force of a tidal wave. "Every contract," Sandra said, her eyes bright with a cold, predatory light. "Every referral. Every email between Frances and Renata about business and about Marcus. In the eyes of the law, they are the same conversation." When the call ended, the silence in the room felt like a physical weight. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. I thought about the 14 years I had spent trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided I was a temporary fixture. I thought about the Sunday brunches, the holiday dinners, and the way Frances used to touch my shoulder and tell me how proud she was of my success. It had all been theater. Every smile, every compliment, every almond cake from Della's was just a prop in a play I didn't know I was starring in. It wasn't jealousy that burned in my stomach then. It was architecture. Frances had been building a replacement the way a builder quietly prepares the foundation of a new structure before demolishing the old one. She had been grading the land, pouring the concrete, and framing the walls of Renata Corbin's new life while I was still living in the house. 2 weeks later, Darren Pruitt sat in Sandra's office with a fresh set of spreadsheets. His eyes were tired, but there was a grim satisfaction in his voice as he laid out the full picture. "The $30,000 moved into the LLC was just the beginning," he said. "I have tracked a total of $78,400 in marital dissipation. That includes the hotels, the jewelry, and a series of cash transfers into a joint investment account Marcus holds with Renata Corbin." Sandra looked at me, her expression serious. "Craig's messages are admissible," she said. "He obtained them through his own civil discovery, so there are no privacy issues. And the text from Frances is the most powerful piece of evidence we have. It shows premeditation. It shows that your mother-in-law was an active participant in the destruction of your marriage." "Laurel," Sandra said, leaning back in her chair. "She is not a party to the alienation of affection suit. We are suing Renata. But when Craig Corbin sits on that witness stand and reads that text message aloud, every person in that courtroom, every reporter in the gallery, and every member of your church will hear her name attached to it." "The birthday dinner," I said. Sandra nodded. "She is building a room full of people to witness your humiliation. We are going to use that same room to witness her exposure." "What do I do between now and then?" I asked. "Nothing," Sandra said. "You show up. You smile. You eat the almond cake she ordered. You be the woman she thinks she has already defeated. The 5 days leading up to the birthday dinner were the longest of my life. I moved through the house like a ghost, watching Marcus with a detached clinical interest. I watched him check his phone in the kitchen, his thumb moving with a practiced furtive speed. I watched him talk to his mother on the phone, his voice dropping into that respectful, compliant tone he only used with her. I realized then that I had never really known him. I had known the version of him that Francis allowed me to see. On the morning of the dinner, I woke up early and drove to the Mecklenburg County Superior Court. The air was crisp, the sky, a bright, hard blue that seemed to mock the tension in my chest. I stood at the clerk's counter, the smell of old paper and industrial cleaner filling my nose. The clerk was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and a kind, tired face. She took the gray folder from my hands and looked at the cover. Aldridge versus Corbin, she read aloud. She picked up a heavy ink stamp and pressed it onto the first page. The sound was loud, final echoing through the quiet hallway like a gunshot. She handed the folder back to me, the ink still wet on the page. "You are all set, honey," she said. I walked back to my car, the folder tucked under my arm like a shield. I drove to the studio and spent the rest of the day working on a lighting plan for a hotel lobby. I discussed sconces and chandeliers and dimming systems with my staff, my voice steady and professional. I was 47 years old and I was a woman who knew how to manage a project. This was just another project. It just happened to be the project of my own life. By the time I arrived at Mimosa that evening, the sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the pavement. I sat in my car for a moment, my hand resting on the leather work bag in the passenger seat. The voice recorder was inside, already turned on. The gray folder was inside, the ink on the stamp finally dry. I reached out and touched the Voss Design logo on my keychain. I had built my business with my own hands, my own sweat, and my own name. Frances Aldridge could take my husband, she could take my house, and she could try to take my reputation, but she could not take the woman who had built that studio. I got out of the car and walked toward the restaurant. The air smelled of wood smoke and expensive red wine. I could see the private dining room from the sidewalk, the amber glow of the candlelight spilling out into the street. I could see Frances standing by the window, her champagne glass raised, her silk sleeve shimmering in the light. She looked like a woman who was in total control of her world. I adjusted the strap of my bag and pushed open the heavy oak door of the restaurant. The hostess smiled at me, a young girl with bright eyes and a practiced welcome. "Aldridge party?" she asked. "Yes," I said, my voice sounding clear and cold in the quiet lobby. "I am right where I am supposed to be." I walked toward the private room, the sound of my heels on the marble floor providing a steady, rhythmic beat to my heart. I was no longer afraid of the room full of people. I was no longer afraid of the almond cake or the white hydrangeas or the white envelope that was waiting for me on the table. I was the one who had written the ending of this play, and I was finally ready to deliver my lines. I pushed open the door to the private dining room, and the cloying scent of Estee Lauder Beautiful hit me like a wall. Frances turned and smiled, her eyes crinkling with that warm, deceptive kindness she had spent 40 years perfecting. "There she is," Frances said, her voice sounding like honey over a razor blade. "We were just about to start." I looked at Marcus, who was sitting at the table with his head down, and then at the empty chair next to him. I looked at the 10 other people in the room, the witnesses Frances had carefully selected for my destruction. I felt the weight of the gray folder in my bag, and for the first time in 14 years, I felt a profound, heavy sense of peace. "Happy birthday, Laurel," Marcus said, his voice sounding thin and hollow. I smiled at him, a real smile that reached all the way to my eyes. "Thank you, Marcus," I said. "I have a feeling this is going to be a year we all remember." I sat down at the end of the table, right where Frances wanted me. I watched the servers bring out the first course, the silver cutlery clinking against the fine china. I watched Frances dominate the conversation, her laughter ringing through the room like a bell. I waited for the second course, for the moment the silver server would click against the plate, and for the moment the woman who had spent 14 years measuring my life would finally find out that she had been using the wrong ruler. The air in the private dining room at Mimosa felt like it had been vacuumed out, leaving nothing but the cloying, suffocating scent of white hydrangeas and Frances Aldridge's expensive perfume. I sat perfectly still, my spine a rigid line against the velvet chair, watching the realization dawn on Marcus's face like a slow-moving wreck. He looked from the gray folder I had placed on the table to the man standing in the doorway, and for the first time in 14 years, I saw my husband lose his ability to command a room. Ted Hartley, the senior partner from Marcus's firm, sat frozen, with a piece of seared duck halfway to his mouth, his eyes darting between the legal complaint and the silent witness who had just entered our carefully constructed nightmare. Frances was the first to move her silk sleeve, whispering against the tablecloth as she lowered her champagne glass with a deliberate, trembling precision. The warmth in her eyes had curdled into something sharp and metallic, a look of pure predatory calculation that I recognized from 100 charity board meetings. She had spent 8 months building this stage, selecting the guests, and ordering the almond cake from Delazal to witness my public unraveling. Instead, she was staring at the blueprint of her own exposure. "I think there has been a misunderstanding about the nature of this evening," Frances said, her voice sounding like honey poured over a razor blade. She gestured vaguely toward Craig Corbin, who remained standing by the door, his charcoal suit a dark smudge against the gold leaf wallpaper. "This is a private family gathering, Laurel. I do not see why a stranger has been invited to take a seat at this table." "He is not a stranger to everyone at this table, Frances," I said, my voice sounding clear and cold. "A stranger, even to my own ears." I looked at Marcus, who was finally blinking his mouth, working silently as he tried to find a version of the truth that still functioned. "Craig is here because he is the man who holds the keys to the secondary phone plan and the LLC transfers. He is here because he found the text message you sent to his wife 2 years ago." The silence that followed was so heavy it felt as if the walls were leaning in. Paula Mercer, sitting to my left, took a slow sip of her champagne and looked at Frances with a clinical, detached curiosity. Marcus finally reached for the gray folder, his fingers trembling as he flipped to the first page, his eyes scanning the bold black text that detailed the $500,000 damages claim for alienation of affection. "Laurel," Marcus whispered, his voice thin and hollow, "you cannot be serious. This is a public filing. My firm, my reputation, everything we have built. It is already filed, Marcus," I told him, leaning forward until I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. "I stood at the clerk's counter 5 days ago and watched the ink dry on the stamp. I have had 14 months to understand exactly what we have built, and as it turns out, I was the only one who didn't know the foundation was made of sand." I reached into my leather work bag and felt the small, hard square of the voice recorder. It was still running, capturing every whispered word and every clink of silver against china. I thought about the white envelope Frances had pushed toward me, the one containing the informal notice of a divorce Marcus had signed 3 days ago. She had wanted to deliver the blow in front of 10 witnesses to make my humiliation a matter of social record. "You mentioned a misunderstanding, Frances," I said, turning my gaze to my mother-in-law. "I agree. You misunderstood the woman I was. You thought I was like my mother, a woman who would accept a museum of silence as long as the lawn was manicured. You thought I was too quiet to notice that you were feeding my husband's mistress contracts through your foundation." Frances straightened her shoulders, her expression hardening into a mask of righteous indignation. "I was protecting my son," she said, the words coming out with a jagged defensive edge. "He needed someone who understood the pressures of his life, someone who could support the legacy of this family in a way you were never willing to do. You were always so preoccupied with that little studio of yours, so concerned with your own success, that you left him a hollow home." "A hollow home," I repeated, a dry, mirthless laugh escaping my throat. "I spent 14 years designing every inch of our lives, Frances. I chose the colors, the fabrics, the lighting, and even the people we called friends. I made a home so beautiful that Marcus could have an entire second life inside it without ever having to move a piece of furniture. And you helped him frame the walls of that second life." Ted Hartley finally set his napkin on the table and stood up. His face was a mask of professional concern, the senior partner at Beaumont and Hale, finally realizing that the man sitting next to him was no longer an asset, but a liability. "I think I should be going," Ted said, his voice clipped and efficient. "Frances, Marcus, thank you for the dinner, but I have things I need to attend to." He did not look at Marcus as he left the room. He did not look at the almond cake from Della's that the server was just beginning to slice at the sideboard. He saw the shipwreck, and like any good corporate attorney, he was looking for the nearest lifeboat. The parking lot of Mimosa was empty and cold when I finally walked out, the air smelling of wood smoke and the sharp metallic tang of an October night. Paula walked beside me, her heels clicking a steady rhythm on the pavement. We sat in her car for a long time, the engine idling, the headlights cutting through the darkness. "You did it," Paula said, her voice quiet. "You took the door off the hinges." "I don't feel like I did anything," I said, staring through the windshield at the neon sign of the restaurant. "I just feel done." The morning after the birthday dinner smelled like stale coffee and ozone. I was standing in my studio at Voss Design, surrounded by the fabric samples and blueprints that were now under attack. Sandra Tate called me at 8:37, her voice sounding tired but sharp. "They moved fast," Laurel, Sandra said. "Marcus filed for divorce officially at 9:15 yesterday morning, just before the dinner. He had the papers ready in his briefcase the entire time he was sitting there watching you eat. I closed my eyes, picturing Marcus in the kitchen that morning, checking his phone with that furtive, practiced speed while I made the coffee. He also filed an emergency motion, Sandra continued. He is asking for a temporary asset freeze and a business valuation order for Voss Design. He wants to claim that the appreciation of your studio during the marriage is a marital asset. He's going after the studio, I whispered, my hand tightening around my mug. Attached to that motion is a sworn statement from Frances Aldridge, Sandra said. She signed it and had it notarized 2 days before the birthday dinner. She calls you erratic, unstable, and unable to maintain appropriate family relationships. Those are the exact phrases she used at the church ministry meeting on Sunday. She's building a narrative pattern, Laurel. If she says it enough times to enough people, it starts to look like established fact to a judge. The clear, cold air of the studio seemed to vibrate with the weight of the betrayal. Frances had ordered the cake and confirmed the reservation at Mimosa, while she was simultaneously signing a legal document designed to strip me of the business I had built with my own sweat and my own name. The birthday dinner hadn't been an ambush. It had been a curtain call for a play she had been rehearsing for months. His outside counsel is James Whittaker, Sandra added. He is aggressive, and he will use Frances's statement to try and paint you as a woman who cannot be trusted with her own finances or her own future. I looked at the drawing on my desk, a lighting plan for a hotel lobby that was supposed to be my biggest contract of the year. Then let's make sure the court sees the full picture of what she built, I said. If she wants to talk about instability, we will show them the 3 years of messages Craig Corbin found. We will show them the foundation referrals she used to fund her son's mistress. The false victory of the dinner was over, and the real cost was finally coming due. I was 47 years old, and I was standing in the center of a storm I had mapped myself. I reached out and touched the glass door of the studio, the letters of my name etched in silver. Voss Design. It was the only thing I had left that hadn't been touched by the cloying, suffocating scent of Frances Aldridge's hydrangeas, and I was going to fight for it with everything I had. The morning after the birthday dinner, the air in Charlotte felt thick with a deceptive, humid stillness, the kind that precedes a summer storm in the Carolinas. I stood in the center of my studio at Voss Design, the space I had built with my own hands and my own name, feeling the cold weight of the silence. The scent of the white hydrangeas from Mimosa seemed to have followed me here, clinging to the fabric swatches and the blueprints like a persistent ghost. I reached out and touched the smooth, cool surface of a marble sample on my desk, trying to ground myself as the world I had known for 14 years continued to dissolve. Sandra Tate had called me before I even had the chance to pour my first cup of coffee, her voice sounding like a sharpened blade over the phone. Marcus had moved with a calculated surgical speed that suggested he had been rehearsing this betrayal for months. He had filed for divorce officially at 9:15 the previous morning, while I was still at the studio finishing a presentation for a hotel client. He had sat across from me at that dinner table watching me open the gray folder, all while knowing that he had already triggered the legal machinery intended to strip me of everything I had left. The business valuation motion was the first blow, a strategic strike aimed directly at the heart of my professional identity. James Whittaker, the attorney Marcus had hired, was a man known for a scorched earth policy in family law, the kind of person who viewed a marriage not as a contract of love, but as a corporate merger to be dismantled for maximum profit. He was arguing that Voss Design, despite being founded before our wedding, had appreciated so significantly during the marriage through the use of marital resources that Marcus was entitled to 40% of its total value. I sat in Sandra's office 3 weeks after the birthday dinner, the afternoon sun casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. The room smelled of old paper and the faint, bitter scent of the espresso Sandra drank in back-to-back meetings. Darren Pruitt was there, his sleeves rolled up, his eyes tired but focused as he navigated the spreadsheets Whittaker had filed as part of the motion. "They are valuing the studio at $1,200,000, Darren said, his voice flat and clinical. "That figure includes your client relationships, your pending contracts, and what they are calling the goodwill of the Aldridge name. They are trying to claim that being Marcus Aldridge's wife is the primary reason your business succeeded." A cold, sharp anger flared in my chest, a feeling more clarifying than any grief I had experienced. I had spent 17 years building Voss Design, 2 years of which were spent working out of a spare bedroom, with nothing but a used laptop and a vision for clean, functional spaces. I had earned every client through late nights and meticulous attention to detail long before Frances Aldridge ever decided I was a suitable accessory for her son. "We have the pre-incorporation records," Sandra said, her pen moving with a steady, rhythmic click. "We are building the wall around this business, Laurel. Whittaker wants to make you spend your resources defending every front at once, hoping you will get tired and settle for a fraction of what you deserve. I looked at the invoices spread across the desk, the names of clients I had won years before I ever said I do. I realized then that Whitaker was not just going after the money. He was going after the narrative. He wanted to rewrite my history so that I was nothing more than a footnote in the Aldridge legacy. The true all-is-lost moment arrived 2 weeks later on a Sunday morning that smelled of rain and ozone. I was standing in the kitchen of the small apartment I had rented in Plaza Midwood, a 2-bedroom space with high ceilings and a view of a neighbor's neglected backyard. I was drinking my coffee, standing up because I had not yet found the time or the energy to buy a kitchen table. My phone rang, and Paula Mercer's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the device. I had been avoiding the church community since the dinner, knowing that the whispers would be reaching a fever pitch. "I need you to sit down," Paula said when I finally answered. "I am standing in my kitchen," I told her, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. "Francis spoke to the women's ministry this morning," Paula said, her voice dropping into a hushed, urgent tone. During the prayer request time, she stood up in front of 47 women and asked for prayers for her son. She said he was going through a painful divorce because his wife had become erratic and unstable. She used those exact words, Laurel. Erratic and unstable. The silence that followed was so heavy I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. I looked out the window at the neighbor's backyard where a child's bicycle lay on its side in the tall, yellowing grass. "Carol Hutchins was there," Paula continued. "Diane Whitmore, the Beaumont wives." Most of the women who know Marcus professionally or socially were in that room. "Did anyone say anything?" I asked, my voice sounding foreign even to me. "No one said anything," Paula whispered. "That is the point. No one ever says anything to Francis Aldridge. They just listen and they remember." I set my coffee cup on the counter, my fingers trembling slightly. Francis had not just written those words in a sworn legal statement. She was now seeding them into the community I had been part of for over a decade. She was creating a reality where I was the problem, where Marcus was the victim of a woman who had lost her grip on herself. She was making sure that by the time we reached a courtroom, the verdict would already be decided in the minds of everyone who mattered. This was the thing my mother had been afraid of. The room full of people looking at you after someone else had already spoken for you. The judgment that arrives before you due already dressed and seated. I realized in that moment that I had spent 14 years trying to be enough for a room that Francis had already decided I did not belong in. I sat down on the floor, the wood planks cold beneath me because there was no chair to reach for. I felt the weight of the 14 years I had given to that family, years that were now being weaponized against me. I thought about the Sunday brunches and the charity galas, the way I had carefully edited my own personality to fit the space Francis allowed me to occupy. I had been so afraid of becoming my mother, so afraid of staying in a marriage for the sake of appearances, that I had almost done the exact same thing by simply being too quiet for too long. I looked at my phone at the number for Sandra Tate. I thought about the folder marked MISC, Laurel, V14, the one that contained the text messages Craig Corbin had shared, and the proof of the foundation referrals Francis had managed. Francis was building a narrative, but she was building it on a foundation of lies. I was building a case, and I was building it on the truth. I stood up and walked to the sink, pouring the rest of my cold coffee down the drain. I called Sandra and told her what had happened at the church. "We let her keep talking," Sandra said, her voice cool and professional. "Every time she repeats those words, she is creating more evidence of her own premeditation. She is being consistent, Laurel. And consistency is the one thing a good cross-examination can exploit." I drove to the studio that afternoon, the streets of Charlotte blurred by a sudden gray downpour. I walked into the dark warehouse space and went straight to the storage area in the back. I found the filing cabinet marked 3, the one that held the records from the years before my marriage. I pulled out a cardboard box labeled Pre-2011 and carried it to my desk. I opened the box and found my first contract dated August of 2010. It was printed on plain white paper, the font simple and serious. My name was at the top, Laurel Voss, Interior Design Consultant. There was no mention of Aldridge. There was no foundation referral. There was only my signature and the signature of a client who had hired me because she liked my work. I sat there for a long time looking at that name. I had been Laurel Voss for 26 years before I was Laurel Aldridge for 14. I had forgotten how different that name felt in my mouth, how much lighter it was. I realized that Marcus and Francis could take my house, they could try to take my money, and they could even try to take my reputation, but they could not take the woman who had signed that contract. The dark night of my soul was not about the loss of the marriage or the betrayal of a mother-in-law. It was about the realization that I had spent over a decade waiting for a moment that was never going to come. I had been waiting for the right time to speak, for the right time to defend myself, for the right time to be the woman I was before the white hydrangeas and the silver cake servers. I stood up and began to scan every page in that box, the blue light of the scanner, the only illumination in the dark studio. I was gathering the pieces of myself, the ones that predated the Aldridge legacy, and I was putting them back together. I called Craig Corbin and told him we needed to meet again. I called Paula and told her I would not be coming to church next Sunday, but that I would be having dinner with her on Monday. The bad guys were closing in, the legal motions were piling up, and the whispers in the church ministry were turning into shouts, but for the first time in 14 years, I could see the exits. I was no longer a wife in a museum of silence. I was a plaintiff, and I was finally ready to tell my own story. The clock on the lower right corner of my laptop screen shifted to 10 at night, casting a pale bluish glow across the wide oak floorboards of my studio. The staff had gone home hours ago, taking with them the chaotic energy of ringing phones, rustling fabric samples, and the constant hum of collaborative design. Now the only light came from the brass desk lamp I had dragged down from my workspace, its warm yellow beam pooling on the floor where I sat. I had pulled one of the ergonomic chairs out from a drafting table, fully intending to sit in it, but I found myself sinking to the wood instead. The floor felt solid, grounded, and infinitely more honest than any piece of furniture in the room. It was lower than I was used to, and on this particular Wednesday night, being as close to the foundation as possible seemed like the only correct posture. Right in front of my crossed legs sat the heavy cardboard box I had hauled out of the back storage room. The faded black marker on the side read, Pre-2011. To my left, the laptop screen remained open to the folder named MISCLAL version 14, the digital archive of a marriage that had been dismantled entirely in the shadows. To my right lay a single sheet of yellow legal paper, where I had written out Sandra Tate's timeline for the next 8 weeks, tracing the path from the emergency motions to the impending trial. The air conditioner hummed a low, steady rhythm that vibrated faintly against the soles of my bare feet. The studio still smelled of the stale espresso someone had brewed that afternoon, mixed with the sharp chemical tang of fresh blueprint paper and the lingering scent of lavender surface cleaner. Outside the large glass windows, the city of Charlotte was settling into a quiet, muffled rhythm, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows across the empty pavement of Dilworth. At 10:17, a soft, rhythmic knock sounded against the heavy glass of the front door. I did not jump. I knew who it was. Paula had sent a text message 20 minutes earlier, a simple question asking if I was still breathing. I had not answered her, but I also had not thrown the deadbolt. I watched the silhouette of my friend push through the door, the bell above it, offering a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place in the heavy atmosphere of the room. Paula walked toward me, her eyes scanning the dark studio, the pool of yellow light, and the cardboard box resting near my knees. She dropped her leather tote bag onto a nearby chair and lowered herself onto the floor right beside me, crossing her legs and settling in without waiting for an invitation. She placed a flat, square cardboard box on the floor between us. The rich, heavy smell of roasted garlic, melted mozzarella, and baked crust instantly overpowered the stale espresso in the air. We sat there in absolute silence for 2 full minutes. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic on Tryon Street and the quiet, measured rhythm of our own breathing. "When is the last time you ate a real meal?" Paula asked, her voice low and steady, lacking any of the pity I would not have been able to tolerate. "Define real," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the yellow legal pad. "Not from a paper bag handed to you through a drive-through window," she clarified. "Tuesday," I told her. Paula nodded slowly, her expression giving nothing away. "Okay," she said. She reached out and flipped open the lid of the cardboard box. "I brought pizza." "It is 10:17 at night," I observed, looking at the steaming slices. "Yes, it is," Paula agreed, pulling a piece from the box and holding it suspended in the air. I reached out and took a slice, the crust warm and rough against my fingertips. I took a bite, the flavors registering distantly in a mind that was entirely consumed by the events of the past few weeks. I chewed, swallowed, and finally let the words that had been sitting in my throat all day spill out into the quiet room. "Francis stood up and told 47 women at the church that I am erratic and unstable," I said, my voice barely louder than the hum of the air conditioner. "Francis tells 47 people everything," Paula replied, taking a bite of her own slice. "That is what she does." "Do they believe her?" I asked. I finally turned my head to look at her, needing the absolute, unvarnished truth that only she would offer. Paula stopped chewing, her eyes locking onto mine. She held my gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching out between us like a physical weight. Some of them do, she answered honestly. For now, the ones who do not actually know you, the ones who only know the version of you that Francis has allowed them to see, yes, they believe her. I looked down at the slice of pizza in my hand, suddenly lacking the appetite to finish it. My mother stayed in her marriage because she was terrified of that exact room, I said, the memory of her silent suffering washing over me. She stayed because she was afraid of what the people in the pews would say if she ever told the truth about my father. She polished the silver and kept the lawn manicured and let herself fade away entirely because the judgment of those women was more terrifying to her than the reality of her own life. I know, Paula said softly. I have spent my entire adult life being so incredibly careful not to become her. I continued, the realization settling into my bones with a cold, heavy finality. I built my own business. I made my own money. I thought I was strong because I did not shrink away from the world. But I almost did the exact same thing she did. I just did it in a different house. I placed the half-eaten pizza back into the box and wiped my hands on a paper napkin. I had been so busy building the case, tracking the hotel receipts, securing the forensic accountant, and documenting every lie Marcus told that I had not allowed myself the space to sit with the actual loss. I realized in that pool of yellow light that I was not grieving the end of the marriage. I was not grieving Marcus, a man who had effectively left the building years ago. I was grieving the version of myself that had stayed so carefully quiet for so long. I had been waiting for the right moment to speak, the right moment to push back, the right moment to finally take up the space I had earned. I had operated under the delusion that if I was just patient enough, the truth would reveal itself without requiring me to burn everything down. I had failed to understand that there is no right moment. There is only the moment when you finally decide to stop waiting. My mother had been afraid of the room full of judging eyes. I had been afraid of becoming my mother. And in the process of running from her ghost, I had allowed myself to be terrorized by the exact same room, just from a different angle. I had let Frances Aldridge dictate the terms of my existence, measuring my worth against a standard she had designed specifically to ensure I would always fail. I looked at the cardboard box in front of me. I reached inside and pulled out a stack of invoices and contracts dated 3 years before I ever met Marcus. I looked at the name printed in crisp black ink across the top of every page. Laurel Voss. I turned my head and looked past the yellow glow of the desk lamp, past the drafting tables and the fabric samples toward the large glass windows that faced the street. Even in reverse, the frosted silver lettering on the glass was clear. Voss Design. It did not say Aldridge. It had never said Aldridge. I had known the answer 17 years ago when I first signed the lease on this space. I had known who I was long before Frances Aldridge tried to tell me who I needed to be. I just had not realized that the name on the door was the only answer I would ever need in the context of this divorce. Paula and I sat on the floor of the studio eating pizza until 11:45. We did not talk about the lawsuit or the church or the gray folder on the laptop. Paula talked about a renovation project she was managing at her own house, detailing the endless frustrations of dealing with uncooperative plumbing and backordered tile. She was not changing the subject to distract me. She was talking about her house because real life was continuing to happen all around us, and being anchored to the mundane reality of broken pipes and grout colors offered a profound, necessary comfort. When the clock on the wall shifted past midnight, Paula finally stood up, brushing the crumbs from her dark slacks. She picked up her leather tote bag and looked down at me, her expression soft but resolute. "Tomorrow is Thursday," she stated, framing it as a fact rather than a question. "Craig Corbin is coming to Sandra's office at 2 in the afternoon," I confirmed, looking up at her. "Call me after," Paula said. "I will call you," I promised. She let herself out the bell above the door, jingling one last time before the heavy glass swung shut. I remained on the floor for a long time, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and looking at the frosted letters on the window. The long, heavy night eventually gave way to a Thursday afternoon that felt entirely different from the day before. I sat in one of the plush leather guest chairs in Sandra Tate's office, watching the slant of the 2 o'clock sun cut sharp geometric patterns across the dark carpet. The skyline of uptown Charlotte loomed outside the massive windows, a grid of glass and steel that housed 1,000 different secrets, but none as meticulously documented as the ones currently sitting on the polished mahogany table between us. Craig Corbin sat in the chair next to mine. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt that looked soft from years of washing no tie, and a pair of worn work boots that felt entirely out of place in a corporate law firm that charged $600 an hour. He did not look intimidated by the surroundings. He possessed the quiet, absolute certainty of an engineer, a man who understood how structures were built and exactly where to strike them to make them collapse. He reached into the pocket of his jeans and pulled out a small silver USB drive, placing it on the table with a quiet, metallic click. 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days, Craig said, his voice carrying the same, flat-measured cadence he had used during our first phone call. I have everything. Sandra picked up the drive, plugged it into her laptop, and projected the screen onto the large monitor mounted on the wall. A sprawling, meticulously organized timeline appeared, detailing every text message, every email, and the exact location data harvested from Renata's phone during the civil discovery phase of the Corbin divorce. Sandra began leaning forward and resting her forearms on the desk. You understand that testifying in this specific case means your findings will become part of a highly publicized public record. Your divorce from Renata is still pending. I know exactly what I am doing, Craig replied, his eyes remaining fixed on the timeline on the screen. This does not help my case and it does not hurt it. It is just the truth. Why are you doing this? Sandra asked, pushing him to articulate the motive that would inevitably be questioned by the defense. Craig finally looked away from the monitor and turned his gaze directly to Sandra, ignoring the files and the data entirely. I knew about the affair 14 months ago, he said, the revelation hanging in the air like dust caught in the sunlight. I found the first set of messages and I did not do anything right away. I stayed quiet because I was watching to see how far Frances Aldridge would actually take it. I wanted to know if she was just going to let the situation play out or if she was going to actively start directing it. He took a slow breath, his jaw tightening briefly before he continued. When Frances started routing major commercial real estate contracts from her foundation network directly to my wife's firm, I understood the architecture of what was happening. This was not a mother tolerating her son's bad behavior. She was funding the affair. She was managing it. She was actively turning my wife into a financial asset for the Aldridge family. And the $40,000 transfer, I asked, remembering the figure Darren Pruitt had highlighted in his forensic report weeks ago. Craig turned to look at me, his expression lacking any anger, replaced instead by a grim, hollow acceptance. That transfer was Frances teaching Renata how to move large sums of money inside a marriage without the spouse ever noticing, he explained, his voice chillingly calm. She taught my wife how to use the foundation as a vehicle to hide assets. My wife learned that specific technique directly from Frances Aldridge, and then she turned around and used it on me. He looked back at the table, his hands resting flat on his denim-covered thighs. When I asked Renata about the missing funds, she told me it was a gift to the foundation and that I should be grateful they even allowed me to attend their fundraisers. That is the exact moment I knew I could not stay quiet anymore. I am sorry, I said the words, feeling utterly inadequate against the magnitude of the betrayal he had endured. Do not be sorry, Craig told me, his eyes meeting mine with absolute clarity. I needed the paper trail far more than I needed the marriage. I am not sitting in this office because I feel terrible for you, Mrs. Aldridge. I am sitting here because Frances Aldridge built a structure that actively hurt both of our families. And as an engineer, I know that the only way to permanently stop a structure from functioning is to take out the foundation. Sandra nodded slowly, the click of her pen slicing through the quiet room. She turned her attention back to the monitor, opening a specific folder marked Communications. Let us look at the message Frances sent 6 months before the birthday dinner, Sandra instructed. She clicked on a file and a screenshot of a text message filled the large screen. It was dated September 14th. I am going to ask you to read this aloud, Sandra said. Craig looked at the screen and read the words verbatim, his voice clear and resonant in the bright daylight of the office. He needs someone who understands what he has to be. Be patient. Hearing the words read aloud in that clinical setting divorced from the dramatic tension of a late-night phone call changed their entire texture. They did not sound like the musings of a concerned mother. They sounded like instructions. They sounded like the words of a project manager coordinating a timeline, advising a contractor to hold steady until the site was fully prepared for the new build. I looked down at the physical table where Sandra had laid out a copy of the sworn statement Frances had submitted to the court as part of Marcus's emergency motion. I stared at the black ink on the white paper. Erratic behavior throughout the marriage, the statement read. Emotional instability. Unable to maintain appropriate family relationships. I looked up at the screen, displaying the text message, and then back down at the sworn statement. The same person had written both. The same aristocratic, measured voice echoed through every syllable. One document had been carefully weaponized to destroy my credibility and strip me of my life's work. The other document had been weaponized to guide, encourage, and sustain the woman chosen to replace me. This text message goes into evidence as Exhibit A. Sandra announced, her voice ringing with the absolute authority of a lawyer who knows the trap has finally been set. The sworn statement goes into the record as Exhibit B. We are going to let the jury sit in that courtroom and read them side by side. 2 days later, the chaotic energy of the week distilled into a quiet, focused Saturday morning. I arrived at Voss Design long before the sun had fully crested the horizon. The sky outside the large glass windows was a pale icy blue that slowly shifted into a bright blinding white as the morning progressed. The studio was completely empty, the drafting tables clean, and waiting for the staff to arrive. I sat at my own desk, a steaming cup of coffee resting next to my laptop. I had spent the first 2 hours of the morning finalizing the presentation deck for the massive Uptown Hotel project. It was the largest contract I had ever secured, and I had won the bid based entirely on a portfolio of work I had completed during my 3rd year of business, long before the Aldridge name had ever been attached to mine. The cardboard box marked PRE 2011 was no longer sitting on the floor. Every contract, every invoice, and every piece of correspondence from the first 3 years of my business had been meticulously scanned, categorized, and sent directly to Darren Pruitt's secure server. James Whitaker's aggressive argument regarding the business valuation was effectively a house of cards. He was preparing to walk into a courtroom and argue that the goodwill and the financial success of Voss Design belonged to the marital estate. Darren was preparing to walk into that same courtroom with a mountain of paper proving that the goodwill belonged entirely to Laurel Voss. I took a slow sip of the hot coffee, the dark roast bitter and grounding on my tongue. I thought about the 14 years I had spent shrinking myself to fit into a space that was never designed to hold me. I had spent over a decade measuring my worth against the silent judgments of a room full of women who drank champagne and discussed charity galas while their own lives fractured behind closed doors. I had been terrified of losing my place at Francis Aldridge's table, completely failing to realize that I possessed the skills and the materials to build my own house. I was officially done measuring myself against a standard that required my own erasure. My phone vibrated on the desk, the sharp buzz shattering the morning quiet. I looked at the screen and saw Sandra's name. I swiped to answer, bringing the phone to my ear. The judge just scheduled the pre-trial conference, Sandra said, skipping any preamble. We are on the docket in exactly 8 weeks. Are you ready for this? I looked up from the presentation deck. Through the frosted glass of the front door, I could see the silhouette of Madison, my newest draftsperson, fitting her brass key into the lock. The heavy door swung open, bringing with it a rush of crisp morning air and the distant sound of city traffic waking up. Yes, I said into the phone, my voice steady, clear, and devoid of any hesitation. Madison walked in, her arms full of fabric samples, a bright smile on her face. Good morning, she called out, heading toward her desk. Big presentation today. I ended the call with Sandra and placed the phone face down on the desk. I looked at the young woman who had just walked into the business I had built from the ground up. South End Project, I replied, my voice echoing slightly in the large open space. Walk me through the lighting plan as soon as you are set up. Madison nodded, shrugging off her coat and hanging it on the rack by the door. Sure thing. Is the coffee on yet? I lifted my own ceramic mug, feeling the comforting heat radiating through the thick clay. I brought my own, I told her. I turned my chair back toward the monitors, the light from the screens washing over my face. There was no grand cinematic moment of triumph. There was no sweeping orchestral music swelling in the background. There was just the steady, ordinary rhythm of a Saturday morning. But it was a Saturday morning that belonged entirely to me. I had spent 14 years navigating a labyrinth designed to keep me lost, and now standing in the bright light of my own studio, I knew exactly where the exit was, and I was finally walking toward the door. The hallway outside the conference rooms at the Mecklenburg County Superior Court smelled of harsh industrial floor wax and recycled air. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a flat, unforgiving glare on the polished stone floors. The sharp click of leather dress shoes echoed against the high walls as attorneys and their clients paced the corridor. It was the morning of our preliminary hearing, exactly 8 weeks after I had sat on the floor of my studio and realized I held all the cards. I sat in a small, windowless meeting room with Sandra Tate, staring at the scarred laminate surface of the table between us. James Whitaker had just left the room. He had walked in with the aggressive, misplaced confidence of a man who believed a well-tailored suit could intimidate the truth into hiding. He had offered a settlement, pushing a single sheet of paper across the table with a practiced, solemn expression. $85,000. Sandra picked up the paper, her eyes scanning the brief paragraphs before she looked up at me. $85,000, Sandra said, her voice dropping into a low measured register. And a non-admission of liability clause. It ends here today, Laurel. I looked at the black ink on the white page. What does non-admission mean? In practical terms, I asked, keeping my hands folded in my lap. Sandra set the document down, aligning its edges perfectly with the edge of her own legal pad. In practical terms, it means Renata Corbin writes a check. In exchange, she formally states that nothing inappropriate ever happened. She buys her innocence. That narrative becomes the official public record. If we go to trial, the trial record would be public, I noted, looking toward the heavy wooden door Whitaker had just walked through. Yes, Sandra confirmed. Craig Corbin would testify under oath. I continued piecing the sequence together aloud. Yes, he would. And the text message Francis sent to Renata would be read aloud in open court, I said, feeling a sudden intense clarity wash over me. Sandra leaned back in her chair. Yes. It would be entered into evidence for anyone in that room to hear. I let the silence stretch out for a long moment. I thought about the 14 years I had spent shrinking myself to fit into a space that Francis Aldridge had designed. I thought about the birthday dinner, the white hydrangeas, and the envelope slid across the tablecloth. I wanted the room to hear the truth. I wanted the people sitting in the gallery to understand exactly how the architecture of my destruction had been drafted. I want Craig to read the text, I said finally. Sandra looked at me, her dark eyes entirely unreadable. You understand that if we reject this, we might not do better than $85,000 at trial, she cautioned. We might secure a larger verdict, but juries are unpredictable. We might walk away with far less. I know the risks, I told her. This isn't about the money, Laurel. I met her gaze, feeling the solid, immovable ground beneath my feet. It never was. Sandra stood up, gathering her files with swift, efficient movements. Then let us go in. We walked out of the conference room and down the long corridor toward courtroom 4B. The air felt colder the closer we got to the heavy double doors. As we passed a row of wooden benches, I caught sight of a familiar face. Ted Hartley, the senior partner from the Beaumont and Hale law firm, sat quietly in the observer section. No one had subpoenaed him. No one had asked him to be there. He was attending voluntarily, a silent representative of the corporate world Marcus had worked so desperately to impress. He looked down at his shoes as I walked past, unable to meet my eyes. Courtroom 4B was a cavernous space, dominated by dark, imposing mahogany and the dry, chilling blast of the central air conditioning system. The overhead white lights were incredibly bright, stripping the room of any warmth or shadow. 2 rows of wooden benches sat behind the wooden divider, and they were completely full. The Aldridge name carried weight in Charlotte, and the gallery was packed with people who had come to watch the spectacle. Francis sat in the very first row, directly behind the defense table, where Renata Corbin and her attorney were whispering furiously. Francis wore a conservative navy blue suit, her posture impeccable, her expression a mask of serene, untroubled dignity. She looked like a woman attending a tedious but necessary charity board meeting. Marcus sat entirely alone on the far side of the gallery. His divorce attorney had strongly advised him against sitting anywhere near his mother or his mistress during a civil tort trial. He looked pale, his shoulders hunched, completely stripped of the arrogant polish he usually carried. I took my seat on the left side of Sandra at the plaintiff table. I kept my back perfectly straight and placed my hands flat on the cool wood. The court clerk rustled a stack of papers, the sound sharp and magnified in the tense silence of the room. The judge took the bench, and the trial began. Sandra spent the first 45 minutes methodically building the architecture of the betrayal. She did not rely on emotional appeals. She relied on Darren Pruitt's forensic accounting. She displayed the spreadsheets on the large monitors, walking the jury through the $78,400 in marital dissipation. She showed them the hotel receipts from Lake Norman and Asheville. She presented the purchase record for the gold leaf earrings, placing it side by side with the photograph of Renata wearing them on the dock, permanently dismantling Marcus's frantic claim that they had been lost at his mother's house. Sandra then established that Renata Corbin had full knowledge of the marriage from the very beginning. She projected photographs from a foundation charity event onto the screens. The images clearly showed Francis introducing Renata to Marcus and me, with my presence explicitly framed as the wife. There was no room for the defense to claim ignorance. Renata's attorney stood up and attempted to build a defense based on mutual consent. He argued that the affair was not the result of alienation by his client, but rather a voluntary choice made by a husband who was already looking for a way out. He painted Marcus as the sole architect of the infidelity, desperately trying to shield Renata from the financial consequences of the tort. It was a weak, frantic argument, and Sandra dismantled it by calling our final witness. Craig Corbin walked through the wooden gate and took the stand. He had traded his faded flannel shirt for a muted gray suit, but he still carried the quiet, absolute certainty of an engineer. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and settled into the leather chair overlooking the courtroom. Mr. Corbin, Sandra began pacing slowly in front of the jury box. In the course of your own pending divorce proceedings, you legally obtained communications between your wife and Marcus Aldridge. Is that correct? Yes, Craig answered, his voice resonant and steady. And you also obtained communications between your wife and Francis Aldridge. Yes. Sandra walked back to our table and picked up a single sheet of paper enclosed in a clear plastic sleeve. She handed a copy to the defense, handed one to the judge, and approached the witness stand. I am going to ask you to read Plaintiff Exhibit A, Sandra instructed. It is a text message from Francis Aldridge to your wife, Renata, dated September 14th of 2 years ago. Can you read that aloud for the court? Craig took the paper. He did not rush. He looked at the printed words, his expression completely blank before projecting his voice into the dead silence of the room. He needs someone who understands what he has to be, Craig read. Be patient. The silence that followed was absolute. No one shifted in the gallery. No one coughed. The words hung in the cold, conditioned air, a devastating admission of complicity. Francis Aldridge sent that specific message to your wife Sandra, stated, making sure the jury understood the timeline. A woman who was at that exact time engaged in an ongoing affair with her son. That is correct, Craig confirmed. Sandra walked back to the table and picked up a second document, this one much thicker, bound by a blue legal cover. And Exhibit B, Sandra said, holding it up so the jury could see the notary seal on the final page. This is a sworn statement prepared and notarized 2 days before a birthday dinner at Mimosa Restaurant. In this document, the author uses the phrases erratic behavior and emotional instability to describe the plaintiff in this case. Do you recognize the signature at the bottom of Exhibit B, Mr. Corbin? Craig looked at the screen where the signature was now projected. Francis Aldridge, he read. The exact same person who sent the text message coordinating the affair in Exhibit A, Sandra hammered home. Yes, Craig said. Thank you, Mr. Corbin. No further questions. I did not turn around to look at Frances in that moment. I refused to give her the satisfaction of my attention. For 14 years I had searched her face, for approval, for validation, for some sign that I was acceptable. I was completely done searching for anything in that room. I looked at the dark wood of the table in front of me and listened to the devastating sound of her own words echoing back at her from the public record. The jury was sent out to deliberate just after lunch. The waiting was a strange, suspended state of existence. We sat in the empty courtroom while the hours ticked by. I drank lukewarm water from a paper cup and watched the dust motes dance in the harsh overhead light. It took them 3.5 hours. When the jury filed back into the box, the tension in courtroom 4B was thick enough to choke on. The foreperson, an older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, stood up and handed the verdict form to the bailiff. The judge read the document in silence before looking out at the room. The jury finds in favor of the plaintiff, the judge announced. A collective breath was drawn in the gallery. Compensatory damages are awarded in the amount of $180,000, the judge read, his voice cutting through the quiet. Furthermore, the jury finds that the defendant acted willfully and maliciously with full knowledge of the marital bond. Punitive damages are awarded in the amount of $140,000. Total damages awarded to the plaintiff, $320,000. A low murmur rippled through the observer benches. Someone in the back row whispered something sharp and shocked that I could not quite catch. Renata's attorney dropped his pen onto the table, the small clatter sounding incredibly loud. I heard the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom open and close. I glanced over my shoulder just in time to see Ted Hartley walking out into the corridor, leaving the trial before the judge had even officially dismissed the room. He had seen the verdict. He had heard Francis Aldridge's name permanently attached to a public scandal involving a partner track attorney. 2 days later, Sandra would receive a quiet phone call from a contact at Beaumont and Hale confirming that Marcus's promotion to senior partner was currently under indefinite review. Sandra placed a warm hand on my shoulder, giving it a single, reassuring squeeze. The divorce settlement hearing is scheduled for 3 weeks from now, she murmured, leaning in close. James Whitaker just lost every ounce of leverage he thought he had. I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes fixed forward. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindication. I did not feel the overwhelming joy of victory. I simply felt the heavy, quiet peace of someone who had finished a grueling, necessary task. I looked toward the narrow window near the ceiling of the courtroom, watching the gray, clear light of a Charlotte afternoon filter through the glass. 3 weeks later, the atmosphere in the private mediator's office was entirely devoid of the theatrical tension that had filled the courthouse. The room was bland and beige, smelling faintly of stale coffee and carpet cleaner. James Whittaker sat across from us, his aggressive posture completely deflated. He had read the jury verdict. He understood precisely where his client stood in the hierarchy of power. Sandra and Whittaker worked through the division of assets for 3 tedious hours. I sat in a comfortable chair near the corner, slowly turning the pages of an architectural magazine, barely registering the photographs of minimalist living rooms and vaulted ceilings. I did not need to fight. Sandra was dismantling the Aldridge estate with surgical precision. The final agreement was brutally simple. Voss Design remained 100% mine. Whittaker formally withdrew the business valuation motion without a single word of protest, retreating the moment Darren Pruitt's pre-wedding financial documentation had been laid out on the table. The marital real estate, the sprawling house in Myers Park that Francis had helped decorate, was ordered to be sold. The proceeds would be split equally, but only after the $78,400 dissipation credit was entirely deducted from Marcus's half. The financial drain of his affair was pulled directly from his own pockets. I requested absolutely no alimony. North Carolina law dictated that a spouse at fault for adultery was barred from receiving it anyway, and I had zero desire to remain financially entangled with Marcus Aldridge for another minute. Voss Design was thriving, and my own foundation was secure. The retirement accounts were divided according to the standard state formula, a mathematical equation completely stripped of emotion. Sandra pushed the final thick stack of paperwork across the table toward me. She handed me a heavy black pen. "We are done," she said softly. I took the pen. The metal felt cool and solid against my skin. I signed my name, Laurel Voss, on the final line. There were no hidden clauses remaining. There were no unexploded traps waiting in the margins. The architecture of my marriage had been completely leveled, the debris cleared away, leaving nothing but empty space ready to be rebuilt. 6 weeks after the verdict, the harsh winter finally began to break. It was early March, and the mornings in Charlotte still carried a sharp, biting chill, though the cherry blossom trees in Uptown were hesitating between tight buds and the promise of pale pink flowers. I arrived at Voss Design at 12 minutes past 8 on a Friday morning. The street outside was quiet, the city just beginning to stir. I unlocked the heavy glass door and stepped into the studio. The air inside smelled of fresh paint samples, rolled drafting paper, and the rich, dark aroma of the coffee I carried in my hand. It was coffee brewed in my own kitchen, in the apartment I had furnished with pieces I actually loved, poured into a ceramic mug I had bought for myself. I walked to my desk and set the mug down. Sitting in the center of my workspace was a massive, perfectly bound presentation deck. It was not for a small hotel renovation. It was the complete design proposal for the lobby and common areas of a towering new commercial office building in the South End. The developers had approached me at an industry event late last November. They had not been introduced to me by Marcus. They had never attended a charity gala hosted by Francis. They had sought me out because they had stayed in a boutique hotel I designed during the 3rd year of my marriage, and they remembered the clean, functional beauty of the space. My phone buzzed against the wood of the desk, shattering the quiet morning. I looked at the screen. "Paula, did you happen to see the local business news this morning?" Paula asked, the moment I answered. "I have not checked the news yet," I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "Ted Hartley officially made senior partner last week," Paula told me, her voice practically vibrating with the weight of the gossip. "They completely restructured the leadership team at Beaumont and Hale. Marcus is apparently no longer on the partnership track. In fact, they moved him to an entirely different division." I paused, holding the warm mug in both hands. "How exactly do you know the internal restructuring details of a corporate law firm?" "Carol Hutchins told Diane Whitmore, who told the woman who lives next door to me," Paula said, the satisfaction evident in her tone. "The church network?" I murmured, a faint smile touching the corners of my mouth. "The exact same network Francis spent all of last fall building up against you," Paula pointed out. "It is incredibly funny how information moves when the narrative suddenly shifts." "I did not plan for that to happen," I told her honestly. "No," Paula agreed, "but it happened anyway. Is that supposed to feel good?" I looked out the large glass windows, watching a city bus rumble past on the street below. I thought about the answer. I searched myself for the petty thrill of revenge, for the gloating satisfaction of watching the people who hurt me fall from grace. It was not there. "Not the way I thought it would," I finally answered her. "It just feels done." "Done is its own specific kind of victory," Paula observed gently. "It truly is." I ended the call and stood up, walking toward the front of the studio. I looked at the frosted silver lettering on the glass, reading the name from the inside out. Voss Design. Those letters had been fixed to that glass for 17 years. I had paid for them with the savings from 3 years of relentless, exhausting freelance work when I was 28 years old. Marcus was not in the picture then. Francis did not exist in my world. There was only me and the clean, serious font I had chosen because it looked like the future. My mother had spent her entire life terrified of the judgment within the room. I had spent 14 years terrified of becoming her. What I had failed to understand until I found myself sitting on the floor of this exact studio eating pizza in the dark was that the room had never actually mattered. The grand dining room in Myers Park belonged entirely to Francis, but the building I was standing in right now belonged entirely to me. I had wasted over a decade standing in the wrong place measuring my worth against the dimensions of the wrong room. I was officially finished with measuring. The front door chimed, pulling me from my thoughts. Madison, my young draftsperson, stepped inside bringing a rush of crisp March air with her. She wrestled with a massive roll of architectural prints, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Morning Madison called out, cheerfully wrestling the prints into the storage bin. Big presentation today. South End commercial project, I confirmed, walking back toward my desk. Walk me through the revised lighting plan for the atrium as soon as you are set up. Sure thing, Madison said, shrugging off her heavy wool coat. Is the coffee maker on yet? I lifted my ceramic mug, the heat still radiating against my palms. I brought my own, I told her. There was no swelling crescendo, no dramatic final declaration. Madison simply nodded, booted up her computer, and began organizing her digital files. It was an entirely ordinary Friday morning. But it was ordinary in the way that only a life rebuilt entirely from scratch, on a solid, unbreakable foundation could be. At exactly 12 minutes before 9, the presentation deck was perfectly aligned on the edge of my desk. My coffee was half empty and cooling fast. I looked toward the frosted glass doors one last time, not checking for shadows or ghosts, but simply indulging the ingrained habit of a designer evaluating the entry point of a space. The sunlight caught the silver lettering of Voss Design, throwing a pale, elongated shadow across the oak floorboards, landing exactly where I used to drag my chair when I needed to work in the natural light. It was just a name on a building, but it was mine. My phone vibrated again. The caller ID displayed the name of the South End developers. I looked at the screen, then down at the massive presentation deck, and finally took one last sip of the coffee. I picked up the phone. Good morning, I said, my voice steady, clear, and ringing through the open space of my own studio. Yes, I am ready. Sometimes you spend years trying to be the perfect fit for a family that never intended to make space for you. This story shows that true strength is never found in remaining quiet, just to keep a fragile peace. When you shrink yourself to avoid someone else's judgment, you simply build a cage with the door locked from the inside. The most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to rewrite your history is to calmly hold on to the absolute truth. You do not have to argue with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Instead, you must recognize the value of the life and the foundation you built with your own 2 hands. Have you ever stayed silent in a relationship just to keep the peace, only to realize it was costing you your own identity? Tell us your experience in the comments below, because your voice finally deserves to be heard.